Welcome back to another AP World History video lecture. This time, we're going to be working on the National Review for Unit 4. So, woohoo! We are walking through these units, getting ready for the AP exam. We are deep into the curriculum here. So let's talk about this unit because actually I think this unit is pretty darn important, and here's why. It is really the change that takes place in the globe that affects us today. If there's ever a change that we are going to be looking at, it is what happens around the year of 1600. Why? Not because Europe and North America all of a sudden become the leaders of the world. It's really important for me to stress that. But because we're going to see a transmission of technology and ideas from the south, the southern hemisphere, up to the north that leads to that change for the next 300 years. So what is this change that we're going to see happen? Well, it comes from the Yuan dynasty. It's going to be new technologies and navigation that leads to colonization with the Europeans. Now remember, I've been making a big argument for a while that Europe's big handicap had been decentralization. Okay, basically numerous different countries competing against each other, but now that becomes its strength. And the reason why is because of the competition of these countries. So here's my big thesis. Yes, I have another thesis. Europe began to rise in exploration due to the exchange of these ideas and technology from China. Their rise, Europe's rise, led to a competition of new maritime empires, and then there was a native reaction. People attempted to hold on to their traditional ways of life. Okay, let's start off with that exchange of technology. Really important here. So Marco Polo, our famed guy that we love to play a lot of good games in the summer with, his family was the one that went out and they went along the Silk Roads and got up with the Yuan dynasty. And there they got things like the astrolabe, the compass, gunpowder, and lateen sails. When they bring that back to Europe, that's going to allow the Europeans to now go out and find new trade routes. And that's really important for our first two major countries that are going to compete against each other, Spain and Portugal. Why those countries? Well, take a look at where they're located. Spain and Portugal are located right up against the Atlantic, right north of the Mediterranean Sea. So both of them are looking for a new trade route because they want to get around the Ottoman Empire. Partially because the Ottoman Empire was a threat militarily, but more importantly because the Ottoman Empire would charge them fees in order to go through the trade routes in North Africa. So that leads into European exploration. The Europeans start to look outwards to find new trade routes. What's a way to get away from the Silk Road trade routes? And they found one. It's called the Atlantic trade route. The Atlantic trade route was first found by the Portuguese, and they're going to find it under a guy named Bartholomew Diaz. So Diaz is going to find the route that goes all the way around South Africa, but when he gets down to South Africa, there's a mutiny on his ship. And the reason why at that time was that he really didn't know how to deal with disease, especially scurvy. Scurvy was a hugely deadly disease. The really unfortunate part about that is all it was a lack of basically vitamin C. And so once they figured out that they could just eat citrus fruits, that solved the problem. But at this point, they didn't solve that problem. So Bartholomew Diaz has to go back to Europe. A few years later, Vasco da Gama, who's also Portuguese, he's going to set up the rest of the trip. So he follows Bartholomew Diaz's path, goes all the way around South Africa. He's going to set up a number of port areas that get all the way out to India, and that makes the connection for the Portuguese. Now the Spanish at the same time, they pick up on this idea. I remember I talked about before, Christopher Columbus was not Spanish, he was Italian. But when he went around to people in Italy, they're like, you gotta be crazy, man, there's no way that we're gonna fund this trip that you're talking about. That was basically an idea to head west and to find a new trade route out to China. They were just like, this is too ridiculous for us to do that. We've got plenty here right on the Mediterranean Sea. Spain, however, at the time was doing something really important. They were creating one country. So Isabella and Ferdinand were centralizing their kingdom into one country, and they needed a way to invest in somebody, to go find wealth. So Christopher Columbus looked like that possibility. Well, of course, Columbus does not find a trade route to China or to India, but he finds two huge continents, the Americas, North America and Mesoamerica. This eventually led to the Columbian Exchange, in which Europeans would get vitally important new types of vegetables like potatoes and maize. They also got coffee. My favorite, there you go. So I think that was pretty important. Native Americans, on the other hand, they got some stuff too. They got cattle, they got horses, and of course they got disease. Probably the biggest diseases for them are malaria, measles, the influenza, and mumps. And that's going to dramatically decrease their population. It depends upon the numbers you look at, but they go anywhere from about 20 to 30 million down to about 100,000 over the next few centuries. Also, this led to the creation of new what are called maritime empires. Remember, we've had those land-based empires. Now we're moving into more like sea-based empires, or maritime empires. Portugal tends to dominate in the Eastern Hemisphere. One exception, they dominated Brazil. Spain dominates in the Western Hemisphere. Now, one thing I want you to notice that's so important about this is the Treaty of Tordesillas. Why is this treaty so important? Because the Pope sat down with Portugal and Spain and said, we're going to divide up the world so we don't have a war between Catholic countries. So notice at this point, this is not a religious war. Okay, this is not a fight between different religious countries. This is a fight over countries that are attempting to gain power in economics. Okay. So what are the consequences of these European maritime empires? Well, first off, I think what's important is to look at what the Spanish did, especially off in the Western Hemisphere. So the Spanish are going to conquer both the Aztecs and the Incas. Remember what they established because of that. The Aztecs are going to establish the encomienda system. The Incas are going to establish the European mita system. So they pick up on that mita system that the Incas had been doing, and they are going to establish their own system of mita. Okay, so the Aztecs, remember, they are put onto encomiendas, and on these encomiendas, they end up exploiting tons of silver that's going to flow out to the Spanish. And please remember what the Spanish did with this. Unfortunately for them, the Spanish are going to misuse that silver. They should have been investing the silver. Instead, what they're going to do is buy goods from outside of Spain, and they inflate their own economy in the process as well. That's going to eventually lead into our second phase, really, in which the British and the French will end up taking over the system. Okay, at the same time, we're going to have resistance to the Europeans, and that comes from local native groups, the indigenous groups, right? So in Africa, we're going to have good examples of state centralization. Good example of that is Anna Nzinga, the queen who ends up forming different alliances with different European groups in order to create a checks and balances system. Off in the Americas, there was violent rebellions, like, for example, Metacom's rebellion, also known as King Philip's rebellion. This was a group of Massasoit Indians who would attack the English colonists because they were expanding out into their lands. This lasted for about 2 to 3 years and created quite a crisis for the English colonists. But for the Native Americans, of course, their big fear was that there was this expansion that was taking place. And we always look back on this and say, the Native Americans, such a tragedy, right, that they ended up being destroyed, which it was a tragedy. But at this point, if you were Metacom or if you were coming from that group, you saw the possibility of success. And here's why. These English settlers really are far away from home. The natives can use the French and the English and pit them against each other during this time. And it looked like there might be a way for the Native Americans to form alliances. But unfortunately for them, that was not the case. Over the long term, they are going to be moved out of that land. We also see a violent rebellion that takes place in Russia. So Russia was expanding as well, forming their own empire. And as they went into places like the Ukraine, there was a group of people there called the Cossacks. The Cossacks were these farmers and nomads. And Russia basically forced them under violence to become a part of the Russian Empire. The Cossacks tried to have a violent revolution, didn't work out for them. Last off, though, I think the third type of resistance is slave resistance. And this is so important because I want you to remember that there's a new form of slavery that is formed at this time. So slavery has always been a part of human societies, but this form of slavery was racial slavery and African slavery. It included that three-continent system, or what we call the triangle trade, from Europe to Africa out to Mesoamerica. And in that particular way, some slaves decided to resist, and the way they did it was through what were called maroon societies. They would escape their slave masters and then go live in the Caribbean amongst their own societies, where they created their own agency, their own cultures, their own ability to live outside of the slave system for as long as they could. Okay, that takes us to the takeaways for Unit 4, such an important unit. Number 1, Europeans exchanged with China, and that led to exploration and colonization. Number 2, European countries had been decentralized. That was their big handicap, but now their decentralization allowed them to compete, form new centralized countries, and they competed for new trade routes and colonies. And then last up, number 3, There were reactions, and those reactions came from indigenous groups. They included state centralization, violence, and reactions to this new form of racial slavery. Okay, we're getting there, guys. We're almost up to our final few units for the AP exam. Stick with it. I'll see you in class.